The 50th floor boardroom at Automotive Mendoza buzzed with tension as CEO Isabel Mendoza, heir to a $2.02 billion empire, faced the biggest failure of her career, a revolutionary engine that no engineer had been able to get running. In her glass and steel office overlooking Madrid, 12 of Europe's top engineers stood before her, men who had spent 6 fruitless months on the prototype. At 29, Isabel was known for her arrogance, and she was on the verge of losing a $550 million contract with Seat when a knock came at the door. It was Carlos Ruiz, 32, a janitor and former Formula One mechanic fallen on hard times, now cleaning offices to survive. Glancing at the engine, he said quietly, Mom, I know what's wrong with it. Isabel burst into mocking laughter and, in front of all the executives, issued the most reckless challenge of her life. If you can fix this engine that 12 engineers couldn't, I'll marry you. The room fell silent. Carlos looked her straight in the eye and replied, What happened in the hours that followed didn't just save the company, it changed the lives of two people fate had tested in the most unexpected way. The 50th floor of the automotive Mendoza skyscraper dominated Madrid's skyline like a monument to Spanish industrial power. Behind the glass walls of the most prestigious office, 29-year-old third-generation CEO Isabel Mendoza stared in growing frustration at the engine threatening to destroy the empire her grandfather had built. 6 months earlier, Automotive Mendoza had signed the biggest contract in its history, supplying Seat with a revolutionary hybrid engine for a limited edition hypercar. $550 million on the line, a deal that would have cemented the company's place among the world's automotive technology leaders. On paper, the project had looked perfect. The R&D team had designed a power plant that combined a traditional V12 with a cutting-edge electric system. Simulations promised extraordinary performance, 1,000 horsepower, near-zero emissions, and unmatched efficiency. But reality had proven very different. The prototype stubbornly refused to run properly. Every startup attempt ended in abnormal vibrations, inexplicable overheating, and a metallic grinding that made the technicians wince. That November morning, the 12th emergency meeting of the month had gathered the company's brightest minds in Isabel's office. 12 engineers stood around the glass conference table, staring at the exposed engine like a modern art piece that refused to come alive. Dr. Alejandro Herrera, the project lead and a Formula One veteran, shook his head for the 100th time. They had tried every imaginable fix, software tweaks, remapping, cooling system optimizations. Nothing worked. Isabel paced behind her desk. In 3 days, Seat ultimatum would expire. If the engine didn't run, the company would lose not just $550 million, but the reputation built over 70 years. The engineers' voices grew louder and more agitated. Some suggested starting over. Others wanted outside consultants. A few talked about admitting defeat. Isabel listened with mounting irritation. That's when someone knocked on the glass door. Everyone turned, annoyed. Isabel's meetings were never interrupted. Through the glass, they saw a man in gray coveralls beside a cleaning cart. Isabel waved impatiently at her assistant to send him away. But the man knocked again, more insistently. He had a serious expression that didn't match his humble role. Exasperated, Isabel opened the door herself. The man was in his early 30s, tall and lean, with calloused hands that spoke of years of manual work. His dark eyes weren't fixed on Isabel, but on the engine in the center of the room. He introduced himself as Carlos Ruiz, night shift janitor. Then, looking at the prototype, he said simply, I know what's wrong with it. The room erupted in laughter. 12 highly credentialed engineers couldn't solve the problem, and a janitor thought he had the answer. Isabel asked who he was. Carlos explained he'd been cleaning there for 6 months, but before that, he'd worked on engines. When Herrera asked, sarcastically, where, Carlos replied he'd been chief mechanic for the Rojo Fuego Formula One team. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone knew Rojo Fuego, the legendary small Spanish team that had punched above its weight with brilliant innovations before disappearing in a financial scandal 2 years earlier. Herrera, who had known some of the team members, grew serious. He confirmed Carlos Ruiz was indeed the technician who had developed the variable injection system for the 488 challenge. Carlos explained what had happened when Rojo Fuego collapsed. He'd been accused of involvement in the financial fraud. No charges were ever filed. There was no proof, but the suspicion was enough. No team would hire someone even tangentially linked to the scandal. For 2 years, he'd sent resumes to every major automaker in Europe. Not one interview. He'd taken the janitorial job to survive, hoping someone would eventually give him a chance to prove himself. Isabel watched him with growing interest. There was something compelling about a man who had lost everything yet still carried himself with dignity and expertise. But she was also irritated by his presumption. Carlos approached the engine slowly, methodically, studying every component like a detective. After several minutes, he declared the problem wasn't the design. It was brilliant, but the assembly. Herrera protested they had followed every specification. Carlos clarified he didn't mean mechanical tolerances. He meant synchronization. The engine had two hearts that needed to be together like a symphony, but they were playing two different tunes. He pointed to a series of nearly invisible sensors. The control parameters had been calibrated separately, first the V12, then the electric motor. That was exactly what they'd done. Following standard protocol, Carlos explained the mistake. You couldn't synchronize two systems that had already been calibrated independently. They had to be calibrated together simultaneously as a single living organism. The explanation was so simple it felt genius. Isabel felt a spark of hope, but also skepticism. If the fix was that obvious, why hadn't anyone else seen it? She said sarcastically that talk was cheap, proving it was another story. Carlos met her gaze calmly, unfazed by her aggression. He asked for one chance, 12 hours, and he guaranteed the engine would sing like a Stradivarius, the room filled with skeptical murmurs. Isabel's anger rose. Who was this stranger to promise results her top European team hadn't achieved? She snapped, calling him crazy. 12 PhD engineers, 6 months of work, cutting edge tech, and he thought he could fix it overnight. Carlos replied quietly that he wasn't claiming anything. He was offering. Isabel stared at him, her competitive side stirred by something provocative in the man. Options were running out. In 3 days, she'd have to admit failure. Then the words came out, the phrase that would change everything, spoken in the heat of the moment. You know what? If you actually fix this engine that 12 engineers couldn't, I'll marry you. The room went dead silent. Everyone stared at Isabel in disbelief. Carlos didn't smile. He looked her straight in the eye with absolute seriousness and said, I accept. His words hung in the air like a dare to fate. Isabel realized instantly the insanity of what she'd done, but it was too late to take it back in front of a room full of witnesses. The engineers exchanged looks between amusement and embarrassment. Isabel tried to regain control by setting rules. 12 hours, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. If the engine ran, they'd honor the deal. If not, Carlos would disappear forever. Carlos agreed. He requested full access to the lab, diagnostic tools, and technical manuals. Isabel granted them, specifying he'd work alone, no help from the team. The rest of the day passed in a surreal atmosphere. Word of the bet spread through the building like wildfire. Some employees found it hilarious. Others worried. Many placed secret bets on the outcome. Isabel tried to focus on routine work, but her mind kept returning to what she'd done. How could she have been so impulsive? If Carlos succeeded, she'd be in an impossible situation. At 8 p.m. Isabel escorted Carlos to the lab, a sterile, high-tech space filled with computerized diagnostic equipment. The engine sat on a test stand surrounded by sensors. She informed him security cameras would record everything to ensure he worked alone. Carlos looked around like a man, finally home. His eyes lit up at the instruments. Before she left, he asked why she'd accepted. Even if he succeeded, what did he gain? He couldn't possibly think she'd actually, Carlos interrupted, explaining that 2 years ago he'd lost everything, job, reputation, future. This was his only chance to prove who he really was. If he failed, he'd be no worse off. If he succeeded, he'd have shown the world Carlos Ruiz still mattered. As for marriage, he said she'd never marry someone like him, and they both knew it, that she'd keep her word, and that would honor her. That night, Isabel couldn't sleep. In her Salamanca penthouse, she lay awake wondering what was happening in the lab. She found herself hoping Carlos would succeed. not just for the personal implications, but for the poetic justice of it. At 6 a.m., she couldn't wait any longer and drove to the office 2 hours early. Security footage confirmed Carlos had worked through the night, completely absorbed, disassembling and reassembling components with surgical precision. At 8 a.m. sharp, Isabel entered the lab, followed by the engineering team eager to witness the moment of truth. The lab looked like the site of an epic battle, printouts scattered everywhere, diagnostic screens showing complex graphs. In the center, the engine seemed somehow different, as if it carried a new presence. Carlos stood beside the test stand. His coveralls were streaked with grease, his hair disheveled, but his eyes shone with a light that had nothing to do with exhaustion. He looked like a general who had won an impossible war. Isabel approached, the skeptical but curious engineers behind her. Herrera leaned over the control computers, studying the parameters Carlos had entered overnight. After a few minutes, he muttered in disbelief. Come on. Carlos had completely remapped the system using algorithms Herrera didn't recognize. Carlos explained some were ones he'd developed at Rojo Fuego to sync the curves with the main engine. Others he'd adapted from aerospace systems. The principle was always the same. Two power systems had to behave as one. Isabel stared at the engine in silence. Outwardly, it looked identical, but Carlos carried the air of someone who had performed a miracle. She asked for the demonstration. Muted. Carlos approached the control panel with calm confidence. Before starting, he briefly explained. He'd created a protocol that made the two systems think as a single organism instead of separate entities. Herrera nodded at the data, admitting it should work in theory. Carlos pressed the start button. The lab filled with an electric hum, followed by the roar of a V12 coming to life. But instead of the harsh vibrations and grinding noise, the engine ran with pure mechanical harmony. Monitors showed perfect values: optimal temperature, fuel consumption within limits, near zero emissions. Most extraordinary was the seamless handoff between thermal and electric propulsion, as if they'd been designed to work together from the start. Isabel was speechless. The engineers crowded around the screens in disbelief. The engine that had tormented them for months now performed better than the original projections. Herrera whispered it was impossible. The numbers were better than the design specs. Carlos explained that when two systems worked in perfect sync, the result exceeded the sum of the parts. Isabel looked at him with a mix of admiration, disbelief, and something that felt like attraction. This man had saved her company, her reputation, and a $550 million contract. He'd done in 12 hours what Europe's best team hadn't in 6 months. Oh, this. But there was one huge problem now staring her in the face. She formally congratulated him, confirming the engine worked perfectly. Carlos thanked her with professional pride and something deeper. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken meaning. Everyone knew the terms of the bet and waited to see what Isabel would do. She told the engineers they had work to do: prepare a presentation for SEAT by noon. They understood the hint and filed out slowly, casting meaningful glances. Within minutes, Isabel and Carlos were alone with the engine that had changed everything. The lab's silence was deafening. They faced each other across the test stand, the engine between them like a witness to the impossible. Isabel spoke first, acknowledging he had kept his promise, in front of 12 witnesses. Carlos didn't press the advantage. He waited for her to decide how to handle the most surreal situation of her life. Isabel began pacing the lab. She'd always solved problems with logic and determination, but this was uncharted territory. She tried framing it as provocation, a joke said in the heat of the moment. Carlos said he understood perfectly. She had all the power to ignore it. She was the CEO of a major Spanish company. He was a former mechanic cleaning offices, but something in his tone struck Isabel. It wasn't resentment. It was sad resignation. She asked what he really wanted. Carlos looked at her intently. He wasn't naive enough to think they'd actually marry. She lived in a gilded world 50 floors above reality. He lived in a small apartment in Vallecas, taking 2 buses to work. What he wanted: public recognition for solving the problem, a job on the R&D team at the level his skills deserved, and keeping up the engagement fiction long enough to rebuild his reputation. It was a rational, pragmatic deal, a business agreement disguised as a love story. She'd save face by keeping her word. He'd get a chance to return to the industry he loved. After a few months, they'd discover they were incompatible. Isabel studied his face for cynicism, but saw only desperation masked as pragmatism. If she said no, he'd go back to cleaning offices, but he'd have the satisfaction of proving he still mattered. She walked to the window overlooking Madrid. The city stretched below, full of stories of success and failure, second chances, and broken dreams. For the first time, she faced a situation she couldn't control with money or authority. She told him he was crazy, completely crazy. The media would eat them alive. Billionaire CEO and ex-mechanic in the tabloids for months. Carlos replied he thought gossip didn't scare her. Isabel admitted it didn't scare her, it annoyed her, but she learned to handle it. After long minutes weighing options she'd never imagined having to consider hours earlier, she made her decision. Fine, let's do it. Carlos raised his eyebrows, surprised by how quickly she'd agreed. Isabel laid out her terms. First, he'd become head of hybrid engine development with a 3-year contract. Second, their relationship would last exactly 6 months. Third, no one would ever know it was fake. Fourth, if he ever betrayed the agreement or tried to hurt her, she'd destroy him completely. Carlos accepted. They shook hands like two CEOs. But when their hands touched, both felt an electric jolt that had nothing to do with business. The first days of the fake engagement were a comedy of errors. Isabel had underestimated how hard it was to pretend romance with someone she barely knew. The media pounced like vultures. The CEO and the mechanic, a fairy tale romance, ran the headline in El País. Tabloids invented romantic backstory. Isabel had to quickly learn details of Carlos's life to field reporters' questions. She discovered he was born in Valencia to a mechanic father and teacher mother, studied mechanical engineering at Madrid's Polytechnic University, graduated top of his class, then been scouted by Formula One. Carlos had to adjust to Isabel's gilded world, Michelin star dinners, high society events, award ceremonies where the hot new couple was in demand. At first, he felt like an actor in a role too big for him, but gradually he relaxed. The turning point came 3 weeks in. It was late, and Isabel was still in the office reviewing final seat contracts. The official engine test had been a triumph, exceeding all expectations. Carlos knocked around 10 p.m. He'd seen her light on and wanted to check if everything was okay. Isabel looked up and noticed how he'd changed in recent weeks. Better clothes, professionally cut hair, confident posture. Fate. But most of all, the spark was back in his eyes. She explained she was reviewing the seat deal. Thanks to him, they'd negotiated even better terms. Carlos sat down and asked a personal question. Why had she really agreed to his deal? She could have walked away from the bet with no consequences. Isabel set down her pen, thoughtful. At first it had been pride. She didn't want to look like someone who didn't keep her word. But now she thought it was one of the best decisions she'd ever made. Carlos had saved her. He'd solved a problem that nearly cost her everything. More importantly, he taught her that real talent had nothing to do with degrees or pedigree. She stood and walked to the window. In recent weeks, she'd realized Carlos was the most brilliant engineer she'd ever met. His solutions were innovative, elegant, effective. The team adored him because he solved impossible problems. But there was more. She liked who she was around him, less arrogant, less convinced she was always right. He challenged her in ways no one else dared. Carlos joined her at the window. He knew it was all fake, just a business deal. But lately, he'd started forgetting where the act ended and something real began. He admitted he'd started forgetting too. Their first kiss was sweet and uncertain, like crossing an unknown line. When they pulled apart, they looked at each other with new eyes. Isabel whispered that this complicated everything. Carlos agreed, but maybe the best complications were the unplanned ones. The following months were a gradual mutual discovery. Isabel learned to appreciate the simplicity Carlos brought: neighborhood tavern dinners, walks in Retiro Park, real conversations instead of polished small talk. Carlos discovered that behind the ruthless CEO facade, Isabel was an intelligent, passionate woman who had hidden her vulnerability behind the armor of success. Under Carlos's leadership, R&D became the company's most innovative division. His unconventional methods drove breakthroughs that put automotive Mendoza at the forefront of the industry. But the biggest change was in Isabel. Investors noticed she'd become more collaborative, less focused on dominating and more on results. The press started talking about a new style of leadership. The decisive moment came exactly 6 months later, when their agreement expired. They were back in the lab where it all began, looking at the engine now in production for seat. Isabel noted that technically their deal ended today. They should announce the breakup, tell the media they'd found they were incompatible. They stood in silence for long minutes. Then Carlos smiled and said there was a problem. He'd fallen in love with her for real. Isabel felt her heart skip. It was a serious problem because she'd fallen in love with him too. Their second kiss was entirely different from the first. No uncertainty, just the certainty of two people who had found something real in the most unexpected place. A year later, Isabel and Carlos's real wedding was the social event of the year. Not just for the romantic contrast, but because it represented something deeper. Proof that love could be born in the strangest ways. During the reception, Isabel gave a speech that became legendary. A year ago, I made the craziest bet of my life. I thought I was only risking my reputation. I didn't know I was betting my future and my happiness. Carlos didn't just fix a broken engine, he fixed me. Carlos replied, a year ago, I was a man who had lost everything. Isabel gave me not just a second professional chance, but my first real chance to love. She taught me that the toughest challenges hide the greatest rewards. Under their joint leadership, Automotive Mendoza became a global leader in automotive innovation. But more importantly, it became an example of how true love and mutual respect could transform not just two people, but an entire organization. 5 years later, when their first son Marco was born, the prototype Carlos had fixed still sat in Isabel's office with a plaque. Sometimes the hardest challenges lead to the most beautiful outcomes. The story became legend in the business world, not for its romance, but for proving that real talent can emerge from anywhere, that love can bloom in the most unlikely situations, and that a bet made out of pride can turn into the most beautiful destiny imaginable. Every year on the anniversary, Carlos would start that engine to remember that miracles happen when talent meets opportunity, and true love when pride gives way to vulnerability. 10 years later, Automotive Mendoza Ruiz, the name changed after the marriage, had revolutionized the Spanish auto industry. But the real revolution was personal. Two people who learned that life's greatest challenges often become its most precious gifts, and that the truest love is born when you have the courage to bet on someone the world has overlooked. The company had expanded into Latin America with plants in Mexico, Colombia, and Argentina. Carlos led technological innovation while Isabel handled global strategy, creating a business synergy as strong as their marriage. Their story inspired a new generation of Spanish entrepreneurs to understand that true leadership comes from talent, not titles, and that the best partnerships, business or personal, are built on genuine respect and admiration. The engine that changed their lives now sits in Madrid's Museum of Technological Innovation, not just as a brilliant piece of engineering, but as a symbol that love and professional success can grow together when rooted in authentic values. Carlos and Isabel continued defying social conventions, proving that class differences mean nothing when two people commit to building something beautiful together. Their story became living proof that Spain had evolved into a society where merit triumphs over privilege and where true love can flourish in the most unexpected places. Sometimes the person who can save you is the one you overlook. Sometimes the craziest bets lead to the most beautiful outcomes. And sometimes love is born when pride gives way to respect at 1.5.